picture the vast Mongolian steppe beneath a leaden sky in August of 1227. The air trembles, not from heat, but from a supernatural, clinging fear. A silent caravan is moving. But this is no trade route, no triumphal procession. It is a funeral cortege. Yet there are no mourners, no ritual chants, no banners lowered in sorrow. There is only the dull thud of thousands of hooves on the parched earth, and a ringing, dead silence, which not even a bird dares to break. At the center of this caravan, in a simple wooden coffin, or perhaps just wrapped in white felt, lies the body of a man who, in life, was the epicenter of a global storm. A man whose name made emperors from Beijing to Baghdad tremble. Genghis Khan, the shaker of the universe. And around this body, the final, most chilling act of his will is unfolding. Warriors from his personal guard, the Kashikten, move alongside the procession, silent and faceless in their armor. But their swords are drawn not for defense. They are executioners. Anyone who chances upon this ghostly procession, be it a shepherd wandering with his flock, a merchant who lost his way, or even a child running from a yurt, is doomed. They are killed on the spot. No scream, no warning. All so that no living soul could ever say where this procession of death was heading. This is the central, unthinkable paradox of his legacy. A man who spent his entire life in the open, whose conquests redrew the map of the world and forever changed the course of history, demanded that his departure from this world be shrouded in absolute, bloody secrecy. The Lord of the world, whose power was limitless, ordered the death of everyone who witnessed his funeral. Why? Why would a man who craved eternal glory for his empire choose eternal oblivion for himself? To find the answer, we must return to the very beginning, to the world that birthed this fear and this brutal logic. A world where the grave was not a place of rest, but the final battlefield. To understand the logic of this bloody command, one must breathe the air of that era. The 12th century, the Great Steppe. This is not a pastoral landscape. It is a giant, boiling cauldron, where tribes and clans replace one another in an endless cycle of war, raids, and betrayal. There are no states as we understand them, only temporary alliances, sealed by oaths that are broken as easily as they are made. The Tatars, the Naimans, the Kirates, the Merkits, the Mongols themselves, they are not nations, but predatory packs, fighting for pastures, livestock, and slaves. In this world, nothing is permanent. Today, you are a Khan. Tomorrow, your skull serves as your enemy's drinking cup. Life is worthless, and the honor of the clan is the only currency that matters. Here, betrayal is not a sin. It is a tool for survival. The future Genghis Khan's own father, Yesugei, was poisoned by Tatars, who invited him to share a meal. This was a typical scenario. In such a world, trust is a fatal weakness. And most importantly, the attitude toward death and what remains after is entirely different. For settled civilizations, China, Persia, Europe, a tomb was a symbol of eternity, a continuation of the ruler's power after death. Pyramids, mausoleums, crypts, all of it screamed of greatness and immortality. But for the nomad, whose home was the entire steppe and whose temple was the eternal blue sky, a stone prison for one's remains was alien, even sacrilegious. Ancestral graves were revered, but they were often hidden so that enemies could not defile them. To desecrate an enemy's grave was the ultimate humiliation, a way to erase his clan from the face of the earth, to strip him of the protection of the spirits. This world, soaked in blood, treachery, and the fear of ancestral desecration, became the soil from which Temujin's character and his final terrible plan would grow. From childhood, he learned the first law of the steppe: that which you cannot protect with invincible strength, you must hide so that no one can ever find it. The story of the future shaker of the universe begins not with the clash of armies, but with quiet, humiliating desperation. He was born, according to the secret history of the Mongols, around 1162 on the banks of the Onon River. The legend, perhaps born later to justify his bloody path, claims the infant emerged clutching a clot of blood in his right fist, the size of a sheep's knucklebone. This was interpreted as the omen of a great warrior and conqueror, a man whose destiny would be written in blood. But reality was far from epic prophecy. His father, Yesugei the Brave, was a minor chief, but his poisoning by the Tatars plunged the family into poverty and exile. His own clan, the Taichiuds, abandoned the widow Holun and her children to their fate, fearing retribution and unwilling to feed extra mouths. This was the first, and perhaps most important, betrayal in Temujin's life. He, the son of a chief, was forced to catch marmots and fish just to feed his family. He knew not just poverty, but the absolute bottom of society, the humiliation of being a nobody. It was during these years that the steel in his character was forged. Cold, hunger, and constant fear were his teachers. This period culminated in his capture by the Taichiuds. As a teenager, he was shackled in a wooden collar, the kangui, a symbol of shame and powerlessness. One night, during his captor's feast, he made a daring escape. Striking a guard with the kongs, he hid in a river, breathing through a reed, while his pursuers searched the banks. This episode is a key to his entire life. It shows not only incredible courage, but a cold, calculating mind, and the ability to endure and wait for his moment. The escape from the Kanga was his personal birth as a warrior. He realized that one man's will, his cunning and resolve, could overcome superior force. And he never forgot the feeling of helplessness and public humiliation. This fear of being shackled again, physically or metaphorically, would haunt him all his life and transform into an obsession with total control. Control over his army, his empire, and ultimately, over his own death and memory. In the worldview of any great leader, spiritual beliefs play a role as large as political ambitions. For Genghis Khan and his people, this spiritual code was Tengrism, the ancient religion of the steppe nomads. This was not a doctrine written in holy books, with dogmas and complex theology. It was an organic, intuitive worldview, based on the worship of the eternal blue sky, Tengri, a faceless, all-powerful, and just higher power. Tengri was not a god to whom temples were built. The sky itself was the temple. The earth, or Etugen, was considered the mother, a sacred entity that could not be defiled. Mountains, rivers, trees, all had their own guardian spirits. This faith shaped the nomads' entire life. They did not plow the land, considering it a wound upon Mother Earth. They would not wash their clothes until they were worn out, fearing they might anger the water spirits. And they had a unique relationship with death. Death was not an end, but a transition. A person's soul, or sun, continued to live and influence the world of the living. Therefore, the cult of ancestors was vital. The spirits of ancestors could either help their descendants or harm them if their rest was disturbed. The body, however, was considered merely a temporary vessel. It was not embalmed, nor was there any effort to preserve it. According to ancient customs, high-ranking people were buried secretly in a secluded place so that no one could find and defile their grave. Often, a horse, weapons, and servants were buried with the deceased to serve him in the next world. But the grave itself was meant to disappear, to merge with nature. Sometimes a herd of horses would be driven over it to level the ground, or trees would be planted. This custom stemmed not only from fear of desecration by enemies, but from a deep philosophical understanding. Entombing remains in a monument, as was done in China or Khwarezm, would have been an act of pride and disrespect to nature from a Tengrist perspective. It would mean tying the spirit to one place, depriving it of freedom. True greatness was to dissolve into eternity, to return to the womb of Mother Earth and become part of the eternal blue sky. Genghis Khan, who saw himself as the chosen instrument of Tengri's will, could not have acted otherwise. His final command was not just the whim of a tyrant. It was the ultimate expression of his religious beliefs. He wanted to depart as a true son of the steppe and the sky, quietly, without a trace, returning his body to the earth so his spirit could soar freely over the empire he had built. The years of humiliation did not break Temujin. They turned his heart into a furnace, forging a new type of leader, unlike any who had come before. He was not just a warrior, he was a psychologist, a strategist, and a master of survival who learned from his own scars. Having endured captivity, hunger, and betrayal, he understood that the old tribal system, based on blood kinship, was rotten. It bred only strife and weakness. He needed a new force, built on different principles, and he began to create it. His first step toward power was the rescue of his kidnapped bride, Borte, from the Merkits. This was not just personal revenge, it was a political act. To do it, he had to seek help from the powerful Karait Khan, Togrul, who was his father's blood brother, and from his own Anda, or sworn brother, Jamukha. The successful campaign against the Merkits brought him fame, and more importantly, his first warriors, his Nukers. And here, he started a revolution. Anyone could join his band, regardless of tribe or clan. The only criteria were personal loyalty and valor. He was creating a new aristocracy, an aristocracy of talent, not birth. But this formative period was also marked by an act of incredible cruelty that historians still debate. He killed his half-brother, Bektor. The secret history explains it as a common quarrel over spoils, a fish or a bird. But the reasons were likely deeper. Bektor, as Yesugei's eldest son, though from another wife, could have claimed leadership of the family. His murder was the cold, pragmatic elimination of a potential rival. Temujin showed that for the sake of unity and the survival of his group, he was willing to shed the blood of even his own family. It was a terrifying lesson for all around him. His will was absolute, and he would tolerate no divided authority. It is here, in these first steps, that the foundations of his future empire and his final command are laid. Creating a brotherhood of loyal Nokers taught him to value loyalty above kinship, and killing his brother showed that any potential threat to the order he was building must be eliminated without hesitation. The witnesses to his funeral, even the most loyal, were just as much a potential threat to his final secret as Bektor had been to his first claim to power. The logic was the same. Absolute security requires absolute measures. Official chronicles and epic tales like to portray great conquerors as men driven by a thirst for glory, wealth, or a divine mission. Genghis Khan had all of these, but the true fuel that fed the fire of his ambition his entire life was an inexhaustible spring of personal grievance and thirst for vengeance. This was his inner demon, his secret, all-consuming motivation. His childhood and youth were a series of endless humiliations that were forever seared into his soul. His father was poisoned. His clan turned its back on him. He himself was locked in a kang. His wife was kidnapped and dishonored by his enemies. Each of these episodes was not just a hardship, but a deep personal trauma, a wound inflicted on his honor and the honor of his ancestors, and he forgot not a single offense. The rest of his life was a methodical, cold, and merciless settling of scores. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he annihilated them, wiped them from the face of the earth, so that the very memory of them would vanish. The Tatars, who poisoned his father, were almost completely exterminated. By his order, everyone taller than a cart's linchpin was killed. The Merkits, who kidnapped Borta, were scattered across the world and ceased to exist as a unified tribe. The Taichiuds, who had enslaved him, were crushed, and their chiefs executed. This was not politics. This was a vendetta on a planetary scale. But his vengeance was aimed not only at specific people and tribes. He took revenge on the very world order that had produced this chaos and lawlessness. His great Yasa, his code of laws, is not just a legal document. It is the antithesis of the world of his youth. The Yasa punished by death for betrayal, for adultery, for theft, for all the things that had been the norm in the steppe. He wanted to build a world based on iron order and unbreakable laws, a world where the humiliations he had suffered would be impossible. And this obsession with order and security extended to everything, including his posthumous fate. He knew that after his death, the world could slide back into chaos. His sons might fight for power, enemies might rise again, and his grave could become a symbol, a focal point for new intrigues. It could be desecrated to symbolically humiliate him and his empire. Therefore, by hiding his grave, he was launching a final, preemptive strike against his enemies. He was depriving them of the chance to take revenge on him after death. He was protecting his last sanctuary from a world he could never fully trust. Thus, the bloody order to destroy the witnesses was not a whim, but the logical conclusion of his life's philosophy, born from the deepest psychological trauma. It was his final revenge on the world for the humiliation he had endured. The turning point that transformed Temujin from one of many steppe chieftains into a figure of global stature was the Great Kurultai, a general assembly of Mongol nobility, held at the headwaters of the Onan River in 1206. This was not just a political meeting. It was a theatrical production, the birth of a new nation and a new era. After decades of brutal infighting, in which he had used cunning and force to defeat all his rivals one by one, including the powerful Naimans and his former Anda Jamuka, the steppe was finally united under one hand. At this Kurultai, representatives of all tribes, who just yesterday had been mortal enemies, swore an oath of fealty to him. The great shaman Kokochu, a man of immense authority, proclaimed him the supreme ruler, bestowing upon him the title Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of this title is still debated. Perhaps it meant Oceanic Khan or Universal Ruler. But its symbolic power was immense. He was no longer just Temujin of the Borjigin clan. He became a sacral figure, the chosen one of the eternal sky, the founding father of a unified Mongol people, the Ulus. But Genghis Khan understood that charisma and a title were not enough to hold power over this roiling sea of former enemies. He needed a system, and he created one. He reorganized the entire army and population by a decimal system, units of 10, hundreds, thousands, and tumens, 10,000. This system shattered old tribal loyalties. Men from different tribes would be placed in the same unit. Their loyalty now owed not to their tribal chief, but to the commander appointed personally by the Khan. This brilliant move transformed a conglomerate of warring clans into a single, monolithic war machine. And over it all, he placed the law, the Great Yasa. The Yasa regulated every aspect of life, from military discipline to hunting rules and family relations. Most crimes, from cowardice in battle to adultery, were punishable by death. The Yasa became the spine of the empire, the instrument designed to ensure order and stability even after its creator's death. It is here, in this act of creation, that another key to his secret burial lies. Having created a perfect order, he was terrified that it would collapse after his departure. His grave, if it became known, could become an object of worship that distorted the essence of his teachings, or worse, a banner for separatists wishing to return to the old tribal feuds. To preserve the Yasa, he had to disappear as a physical object, remaining only as the spirit of the law, the unseen founder of the nation. After uniting the Mongols in 1206, Genghis Khan's gaze turned beyond the steppe. Before him lay a giant chessboard, occupied by ancient, wealthy, and, as he believed, morally decayed, settled civilizations. Each was powerful in its own way, but each had fatal vulnerabilities that the brilliant strategist and psychologist saw clearly. To the south, beyond the Great Wall, lay two fragments of the former Chinese Empire. In the northeast was the Yurshen state, the Jin dynasty, with its rich cities, including the capital Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. The Jin possessed a huge army and advanced technology, including gunpowder weapons. But it was internally weak. The Jurchen elite was mired in luxury and intrigue, and millions of conquered Chinese subjects hated their masters. Genghis Khan saw their opulent palaces and tombs not as symbols of power, but as signs of weakness and attachment to the material, which made them vulnerable. To the west of the Jin lay the Tangut kingdom of Xixia. It was a strong state that controlled parts of the Silk Road, with a sophisticated culture and a powerful army. But it was squeezed between three giants: the Jin, the Song Empire to the south, and the Tibetans. Genghis Khan saw it as the ideal first target, a buffer zone to be subdued before the assault on the Jin. But the most powerful and wealthy empire lay further west, the giant Khwarezmian Empire, stretching from India to the Caspian Sea. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Gorganj, were jewels of the Islamic world, centers of science, craft, and trade. The army of the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II numbered, by some estimates, up to 400,000 men. Khwarezm seemed indestructible, but here too, Genghis Khan spotted the Achilles heel. The empire was a patchwork quilt, stitched together from many recently conquered peoples, and the Shah himself was arrogant, short-sighted, and in conflict with his own mother and spiritual leaders. Analyzing these opponents, Genghis Khan saw a common trait. Their strength was concentrated in visible, material objects: cities, fortresses, treasuries, and ancestral tombs. Capture or destroy these centers, and the state would crumble. He would apply this lesson to himself, but in reverse. To ensure his empire would not crumble, its spiritual center, his grave, had to become invisible, immaterial, and thus invulnerable. The military genius of Genghis Khan lay not so much in tactical innovations as in a system perfected to the extreme, based on discipline, mobility, intelligence, and above all, psychology and deception. His army was not just an armed force, but a single organism, a deadly avalanche that moved with incredible speed and coordination. He understood that the main battle is won before it even begins, in the minds of the opponents. Therefore, colossal importance was given to intelligence. Before every campaign, hundreds of spies, merchants, and defectors were sent ahead to gather detailed information about roads, water sources, troop deployments, the political situation, and enemy morale. He knew his enemy better than the enemy knew himself. One of his signature tactics was the feigned retreat. Mongol light cavalry would engage in battle, shower the enemy with arrows, and then turn in a mock flight. The enemy, believing in an easy victory, would break ranks and give chase, falling straight into a prepared ambush where they were met by fresh, heavy cavalry. This maneuver, requiring supreme discipline, was drilled to perfection and brought success time after time. But Genghis Khan's main weapon was terror. This was not mindless sadism, but a cold, calculated instrument of state policy. Before storming a city, its inhabitants were always offered terms of surrender. If the city surrendered without a fight, it was usually spared and merely paid tribute. But if it resisted, a terrible fate awaited it. After the city was taken, artisans and young women were taken into slavery, and the rest of the population was methodically exterminated. Rumors of this cruelty, often exaggerated by the Mongols themselves, flew ahead of their army, paralyzing the will to resist in the next cities. His entire military philosophy was built on concealing his true intentions. He might demonstratively move an army in one direction, while his main forces made a flanking maneuver through the desert, appearing where no one expected them. He was a master of disinformation, stratagems, and surprise attacks. And this philosophy of total concealment became his second nature. If winning a war required hiding his armies and his plans, then ensuring the eternal security of his empire and his legacy required hiding the most important thing of all: his body, his final stronghold. His funeral became his final military operation, conducted according to all the rules of strategy, where the main objective was to mislead the most powerful enemy of all: time. Nothing illustrates the life lessons learned by Genghis Khan better than his complex and tragic relationship with Jamuka, his Anda, his sworn brother. In their youth, they were inseparable. Twice they swore an oath of eternal friendship, exchanging gifts and speaking sacred words. Jamuka, who came from a noble lineage, helped Temujin more than once in difficult times, including the campaign against the Merkits. But as Temujin's star rose and his principles of governance, based on meritocracy, attracted more and more warriors, a rift began to grow between the sworn brothers. Jamuka was an adherent of the old aristocratic system, where power belonged to the nobility by right of birth. He saw Temujin as a dangerous upstart, destroying the age-old foundations. Their paths diverged, and they became irreconcilable enemies, leading rival coalitions of tribes. Their rivalry lasted for nearly 20 years and was full of dramatic turns. In one battle, Temujin was wounded in the neck by an arrow, and his loyal noker Jelme spent the entire night sucking the clotted blood from the wound, saving his life. On another occasion, Jamuka displayed unheard-of cruelty, boiling 70 captured chieftains alive in cauldrons, an act that drove many supporters away from him. The end of this drama came in 1205. Betrayed by his own men, Jamuka was handed over to Genghis Khan. The victor offered his former sworn brother peace and a place by his side. But Jamuka refused. In his final words, as recorded in the secret history, one hears bitterness and fatalism. He asks for a noble death without the spilling of blood, as befits a person of Khan's lineage, so his spirit could depart peacefully. Genghis Khan honored his request. Jamuka's back was broken. Before this, he supposedly told Genghis Khan, "You feared me in your dreams. Now I will become the eternal guardian of your peace." This story left the most profound scar on Genghis Khan's soul. It became for him the ultimate proof that in the world of power, there is no room for friendship or sacred oaths. If even an Anda, a man with whom he shared food and dreams, could become a mortal enemy, then who could be trusted at all? This lesson was seared into his consciousness. He never fully trusted anyone again, except perhaps his mother and his first wife. And when the time came to think about his own death, he could not entrust the secret of his grave to any living person, not his sons, not his closest companions. The betrayal of Jamukha taught him that any secret known to even one person will sooner or later cease to be a secret. The only way to keep a secret forever is to destroy all who know it. If the betrayal of Jamukha was a personal tragedy, the event known in history as the Otrar catastrophe became a geopolitical drama that changed the map of the world and solidified Genghis Khan's darkest convictions. By 1218, the Mongol Empire and the powerful Khwarezmian Empire had become neighbors. Genghis Khan, busy with the war against the Jin Empire in China, was not seeking conflict in the West. On the contrary, he was interested in trade. He sent a large trade caravan of 450 merchants, mostly Muslim, and his ambassadors to Khwarezm, carrying valuable goods and an offer of peace and free trade. His message to the Khwarezm Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II was respectful. "I am the master of the lands of the rising sun, and you are the master of the lands of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace." But when the caravan arrived in the border city of Otrar, its governor, Inalchuk, an uncle of the Shah, suspected the merchants of espionage. He ordered the entire caravan to be massacred and the goods plundered. Only one camel driver managed to escape, and he brought the terrible news to Genghis Khan's camp. This was an unprecedented insult and a violation of all laws, both the Mongol yasa and international customs, according to which ambassadors and merchants were inviolable. Genghis Khan, nevertheless, showed restraint. He sent a second embassy directly to the Shah, demanding that Inalchuk be handed over for punishment. But the arrogant and short-sighted Muhammad, incited by his entourage, made a fatal mistake. He not only refused, but he ordered the head of the embassy to be executed, and the other ambassadors to have their beards shaved off and be sent back in humiliation. This was a spit in the face of the Shaker of the universe. From that moment, war was inevitable. As legend has it, upon hearing the news, Genghis Khan ascended a hill, removed his headdress, faced the eternal sky, and prayed for 3 days and 3 nights, asking Tengri for the strength to take vengeance. For him, this was not just a political conflict. It was sacrilege, a desecration of the very concept of law and honor. The world, in his eyes, was definitively revealed as a place where nothing was sacred, where treachery and stupidity reigned. And if rulers could so easily break laws and kill ambassadors, what would stop their descendants from digging up and defiling his grave? The Otrar catastrophe became for him the final proof that no one and nothing could be trusted. Any sanctuary left to the mercy of this world would be defiled. The only way to protect it was to make it invisible and unreachable. The war with Khwarezm, which began in 1219, became the pinnacle of Genghis Khan's military art and the apex of his power. He moved an army to the west, numbering, by various estimates, from 100 to 150,000 warriors. But this was not just an army. It was a machine of annihilation, honed to perfection. The Khwarezm Shah Muhammad, despite having numerical superiority, made a fatal strategic error. Instead of meeting the Mongols in a decisive field battle, he scattered his forces among the garrisons of large cities, hoping to wait them out behind their powerful walls. This was precisely what Genghis Khan had expected. He divided his army into several parts, which, like the fingers of a giant hand, gripped Khwarezm from different sides, giving the enemy no time to recover. The siege and capture of Otrar, the city where the ambassadors were killed, was a matter of honor. The city held out for several months but was taken. Its governor, Inalchuk, was executed by torture. Molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic retribution for his greed. Then the Mongol avalanche rolled on, sweeping away everything in its path. The greatest cities of that time fell: Khujand, Bukhara, and finally, the Pearl of the East, Samarkand. During the capture of Bukhara, a significant episode occurred. Entering the city's main mosque, Genghis Khan ascended the minbar, the pulpit for sermons, and, addressing the city's notables, herded into the square, delivered his famous speech. He declared himself the scourge of God, sent by heaven to punish them for their sins. If you had not committed great sins, he said, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. In that moment, he fully realized himself not just as a Khan or a conqueror, but as an instrument of a higher, divine will. He was the judge and the executioner, carrying out the sentence passed by Tengri. This self-perception had colossal consequences for his ideas about his own place in the world and after death. If he was an instrument of heaven, then his departure from life could not be ordinary. He could not be buried like a simple mortal ruler in a magnificent tomb that would become an object of worship or, conversely, hatred. His departure had to match his mission, to be as inevitable, mysterious, and final as a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. He had to simply disappear, dissolve, returning to his master, the eternal sky, not leaving behind anything material that could be distorted or defiled by men. At the very peak of his power, when it seemed the entire world lay at his feet, Genghis Khan faced a problem that neither his brilliant tactics nor his invincible army could solve. It was the problem of the future, the problem of succession. He had 4 sons by his beloved wife, Berta, and all of them were strong, ambitious individuals, true Chinggisids. The eldest, Yuchi, was a brave warrior, but the shadow of doubt hung over his lineage. He was born shortly after Berta's return from Merkit captivity, and malicious tongues whispered all his life that he was not Genghis Khan's son. The second son, Chagatai, was severe and uncompromising, a guardian of the Yasa, but also harsh and difficult. He openly feuded with Juchi, once calling him a Merkit bastard in council. The third son, Ogadai, had a kind disposition, was generous and loved by the people, but was prone to drinking and lacked his father's iron will. The youngest, Tolui, was a talented general, but by Mongol custom, as Achagan, keeper of the hearth, he was to inherit only his father's homeland. Genghis Khan saw this disunity and understood the danger it posed to the empire's future. He once gathered his sons at a Kurultai to decide the question of the heir. The conversation immediately escalated into a fierce argument between Juchi and Chagatai, nearly ending in a brawl. With a heavy heart, the great Khan realized that neither his eldest nor his second son could maintain unity. He was forced to make a compromise choice in favor of Ogadai, forcing the other brothers to swear allegiance to him. This episode became a terrible omen for him. If his sons were ready to tear at each other's throats while he was still alive, what would happen after his death? He, the creator of the largest continental empire in history, realized with horror that his greatest creation could crumble to dust because of the ambitions of his own children. And in this context, the question of his burial took on a new, sinister dimension. A known and revered tomb of the founding father could become not a symbol of unity, but an apple of discord. Different factions could use it as a banner in the struggle for power. The grave could become a sacred center, control of which would grant legitimacy to one claimant or another. To prevent this, to deny his descendants even the slightest pretext for infighting related to his remains, he had to eliminate the object of dispute itself. The grave must not exist. No one must know its location, so no one could use it in their political games. It was a bitter, but logical decision. He was saving his legacy from his own blood. After the rout of Khwarezm and a 7-year campaign that brought his armies to the Caucasus and the banks of the Dnieper, Genghis Khan returned to the east. But here, an unpleasant surprise awaited him, which became the final drop that overflowed his cup of mistrust in human nature. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia, which he had subjugated at the very beginning of his conquests, had broken its vassal oath. The Tanguts not only refused to provide troops for the campaign against Khwarezm, but according to rumors, had entered into an alliance with his enemies. For Genghis Khan, this was not just political treason, it was perjury, one of the most grievous sins under his great Yasa. It was a personal insult. While he was in the West, passing judgment on the treacherous Khwarezm Shah, he had been stabbed in the back by those he considered his tributaries. In 1226, despite his advanced age, he was over 60, and the pleas of his commanders, he personally led a punitive expedition against the Tanguts. This war was unlike any other. It was not a conquest for tribute or territory. It was a war of annihilation, an act of cold, methodical retribution. He wanted to teach the world a final, terrible lesson about what happens to those who break an oath given to the Shaker of the universe. The Mongol army, systematically, city by city, wiped the Tangut civilization from the face of the earth. Flourishing cities were destroyed, unique books and works of art were annihilated, and tens of thousands of people were exterminated. This was a genocide, dictated by icy rage and political calculation. Genghis Khan wanted to create a scorched desert around his empire so that no one would ever again think of betrayal. It was during this final, most brutal campaign that his health was finally broken. And it was here, amidst the smoking ruins of Tangut cities, looking at the results of yet another act of treachery, that he likely made the final decision about the fate of his own body. If even vassals, bound by oath and fear, are capable of betrayal, then what can be expected from future generations, from foreign peoples, from history itself? No one could be trusted. Nothing could be left to chance. His final resting place had to be protected not by the walls of a mausoleum, but by absolute, impenetrable secrecy, sealed by fear and blood. The betrayal of the Tanguts was the last argument that turned the idea of a secret burial into an irrevocable command. Genghis Khan's final campaign against the Tangut kingdom of Xixia was the apotheosis of his military power and his concept of justice, which, in his mind, was synonymous with retribution. It was a war devoid of any sentimentality or profit-driven pragmatism. It was a punitive operation, an almost ritualistic act, designed to demonstrate to the universe the consequences of breaking one's word to him. The Mongol army, hardened in battles from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian, descended upon the Tanguts like a natural disaster. They did not just win battles, they systematically destroyed the very foundation of Tangut civilization. Cities that offered resistance were razed to the ground, their population slaughtered. Chronicles report mountains of skulls, of rivers changing color from the blood. Even nature itself seemed to shudder from this war. The Mongols filled in irrigation canals and cut down orchards, turning a flourishing oasis into a desert. This was an act of sociocide, the conscious destruction of an entire society. Genghis Khan, already feeling the approach of death, was implacable. He personally directed the siege of the Xixia capital, Zhongxing. His will, forged by decades of battles and hardships, knew no bounds. He wanted to leave this world having left behind not only the greatest empire, but also the greatest fear, one that would, for centuries, deter anyone from challenging his legacy. This war was his testament, written in blood and fire on the body of the Tangut people. And in this atmosphere of total annihilation, where death became commonplace and human life lost all value, the idea that preserving the secret of his grave would require killing a few hundred or even thousands of random witnesses no longer seemed extraordinary. It was just another military operation, another necessary measure to achieve a strategic goal. If ensuring the stability of the empire required wiping out an entire nation, what were the lives of a few random people compared to the eternity of his legacy? The logic of war was extrapolated to the logic of burial. The executors of his final will, his loyal Geschichten, were products of this same system. They were trained to obey any command without question, even the most brutal, in the name of a higher purpose. Therefore, when the order was given, it caused neither surprise nor moral turmoil. It was their final service to the great Khan, the last act of absolute loyalty, taken to its bloody but logical conclusion. In the autumn of 1226, during a great hunt, which was not only entertainment, but also a military drill for the Mongol army, an event occurred that foreshadowed the end of an era. Genghis Khan, who had spent his entire life in the saddle and was one of the finest horsemen of his time, fell from his horse. Sources differ on the details. One version says his horse was spooked by wild asses, another that he was wounded. Either way, the fall was severe. The great Khan, now in his late 60s, suffered serious internal injuries and a high fever. For the first time in many years, his iron constitution failed. This incident made a huge impression on both him and his entourage. The man who seemed the embodiment of superhuman strength, a demigod invulnerable to enemy arrows and treacherous poisons, turned out to be vulnerable to a simple accident. The shaker of the universe was brought down, not by an enemy sword, but by a simple fall from a horse. This event made him keenly feel his own mortality. Lying in his camp, tormented by pain and fever, he was forced to confront the fact that his time on Earth was ending. His sons and generals begged him to break off the campaign against the Tanguts and return to his homeland to recover. But he was adamant. He declared that if he returned without completing his revenge, the Tanguts would see it as a sign of weakness and would never be subservient again. His will overcame his physical frailty. He ordered the war to continue, hiding his illness from the army so as not to undermine its morale. But from that moment, preparing for his own departure became his main, secret task. He had to give his final orders concerning the future of the empire, and just as importantly, develop a detailed plan for his own funeral. The fall from the horse was the final push that transformed scattered thoughts about death into a clear and relentless strategy. He realized that his departure must be as carefully planned and directed as his greatest battles, and in this plan, there could be no room for chance, weakness, or sentimentality. He had to leave undefeated, not only on the battlefield, but also in the battle against oblivion and decay. Feeling that his days were numbered, Genghis Khan focused not on mystical revelations or writing memoirs, but on what he considered his life's main work, strengthening the system that was meant to outlive him. His true testament was not a final will, but his great yasa. This code of laws was not just a codex to him, it was an almost sacred text, the framework upon which the entire empire rested. The yasa was the embodiment of his dream of order, which had come to replace the tribal chaos of his youth. It was universal and binding on everyone, from the common soldier to his own sons. And before his death, he thought primarily about how to ensure its immutability. He summoned his sons, Ogedei and Tolui. Juchi had already died by this time, and Chagatai was in his own ulas, and gave them his final instructions. He reaffirmed that his heir would be Ogedei, and made them swear an oath to maintain unity. He laid out for them a detailed plan for the final conquest of the Jin Empire, which his descendants would execute precisely. He spoke not as a dying father, but as a strategist looking decades ahead. In this context, his decision for a secret burial was inextricably linked to his concern for the yasa and the empire's stability. He understood that any religion or cult that might arise around his grave could eventually conflict with the spirit and letter of the Yasa. History knew many examples of a founder's teachings being distorted by his followers. He did not want his grave to become the center of a new religious cult, with priests, rituals, and dogmas that could supplant the strict and pragmatic laws of the Yasa. He wanted to remain in memory, not as a deity to be worshipped, but as the first legislator, whose statutes must be obeyed. To preserve the purity of his teaching, he had to eliminate the object of potential idolatry, his own body. His legacy was to be intangible. It was the law, the order, the unified state. Everything material, including his remains, was transient and dangerous. Therefore, he chose to turn his grave not into a shrine, but into a state secret. It was an act of supreme state pragmatism. He sacrificed his posthumous glory, his material monument, for the preservation of his main creation, an empire living by his laws. Genghis Khan was not only a brilliant general, but also a man who deeply understood the psychology of power and human history, as far as he knew it, through oral traditions and stories from advisors from conquered lands. He knew that the greatest rulers of the past, who built grandiose tombs for themselves, ultimately lost their battle with time and human greed. The tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs, despite all their cunning traps and curses, were looted. The kurgans of the Scythian kings were excavated. The mausoleums of Chinese emperors, though guarded by terracotta armies, were desecrated multiple times during periods of unrest. He understood that any monument created by human hands could be destroyed by human hands. Any treasure hidden in the earth would, sooner or later, be found. And his grave, without a doubt, would become the most coveted prize in the world. Untold treasures, seized from dozens of countries, would be buried there. But it wasn't just about the gold. For the enemies of the Mongol Empire, desecrating his grave would be the ultimate act of triumph and revenge. To destroy his remains would be to symbolically destroy his spirit, his legacy, and to strike an irreparable blow to the sacred foundation of the state he had created. He, who had spent his life avenging the humiliation of his clan, could not allow such humiliation to befall him after death. This fear of desecration was one of the most powerful driving forces behind his decision. He decided to make a preemptive move. If it is impossible to build a tomb that no one can rob, then one must create a tomb that no one can find. It was an asymmetrical and brilliant response. He refused to play by the rules of settled civilizations. Instead of building the most fortified tomb in the world, he decided to build none at all. His fortress would be the geography itself, the boundless steppe. His defense would not be stone walls, but absolute secrecy. And this secret had to be protected by the most reliable means, the death of all who knew it. This may seem monstrously cruel, but from the perspective of his icy, pragmatic logic, it was the only 100% guarantee. He did not trust curses. He did not trust traps. He did not even trust the loyalty of his descendants. He trusted only in death. Only the dead do not talk. Thus, he ensured for himself a posthumous security that no pharaoh or emperor had ever known. Beyond personal fears and religious beliefs, Genghis Khan's decision to hide his burial place involved cold, political calculation. He thought not in terms of years, but of centuries, and he understood perfectly well that his grave, were it known, would immediately become a powerful political and sacred object that could be used for various purposes. First, it would inevitably become a center of pilgrimage. People from all over the vast empire would flock to it to worship the founder. At first glance, this might seem to promote unity. But Genghis Khan also saw the downside. Such a place would quickly acquire its own staff of priests, interpreters of his will, who might begin to compete with the central Khan's authority. The grave could give birth to a new religious or political force, uncontrollable by his heirs. Second, in the event of future rebellions or separatist movements, Genghis Khan's grave could become a symbolic banner for the rebels. By seizing control of the founder's tomb, any rebellious Khan or chieftain could declare his claim to supreme power, asserting that he was the true successor to Genghis Khan's cause and that the spirit of the great ancestor was on his side. The grave, as a symbol of unity, would transform into a catalyst for disintegration. Third, he could not rule out an external threat. What if, in the future, one of the conquered nations, like the Chinese or the Persians, regained strength and marched on the Mongols? The first target of such a campaign of revenge would undoubtedly be the grave of the hated conqueror. Its destruction would have a colossal demoralizing effect on the Mongols. By eliminating the grave as a physical object, Genghis Khan eliminated all these risks. He created a vacuum at the very center of his empire, one that could not be captured, could not be used for political ends, and could not be destroyed. His legacy became decentralized, diffused throughout the empire in the form of his laws, his army, his descendants. The guardian spirit should not be tied to one place. It must be everywhere and nowhere at once. This was a brilliant strategic decision. He turned his greatest potential vulnerability into his greatest strength. The absence of a grave made his myth even more powerful. He became not just a dead ancestor, but an omnipresent spirit of the nation, whose unseen gaze watches over his descendants from the eternal blue sky. In Genghis Khan's decision, one can see not only fear and pragmatism, but also a deeply symbolic act, a conscious return to his roots, to the values of the nomadic world he had left behind to create an empire, but to which, in his heart, he remained loyal to the end. He spent his entire life in opposition to the world of settled civilizations. He conquered their cities, admired their artisans and scholars, and used their administrative know-how to manage his empire. But at the same time, he deeply despised their effeminacy, their attachment to luxury, their complex and, from his point of view, hypocritical rituals. The lavish funerals that Chinese emperors, or Khwarezm Shahs, arranged for themselves, with their grandiose mausoleums filled with treasures and days-long ceremonies, seemed to him a manifestation of weakness and pride. It was an attempt to cheat death with stone and gold, an attempt doomed to failure. For him, a man of the steppe, true greatness lay not in this. It lay in unity with nature, in freedom of movement, in simplicity and harsh functionality. His palace was a simple yurt, albeit larger than others. His wealth was countless herds of horses, not piles of gems in a treasury, and his departure from life had to match this philosophy. By choosing a secret burial according to the ancient custom of his ancestors, he was, as it were, drawing a line under his life. He, the Lord of the universe, who had conquered dozens of kingdoms, in his final hour rejected everything foreign and superficial, everything he had seen in the conquered cultures. He refused a Chinese-style mausoleum, a tomb like those he had seen in Samarkand. He wanted to be buried as a simple Mongol warrior, with no name on his grave, no monument, no honors. His body was to simply return to the earth that bore him and dissolve into it without a trace. This was a powerful symbolic gesture. He was, in effect, telling his descendants, "Do not become like those we defeated. Do not let luxury and foreign customs corrupt you. Remember who you are and where you came from." His invisible grave became his final lesson, his final sermon on the nomadic way of life, his eternal reminder that true strength lies not in stone, but in spirit. Beyond the pragmatic and psychological reasons, Genghis Khan's decision likely included a deep mystical aspect, tied to Tangrist beliefs about the energy of the land. For nomadic peoples, the earth was not just territory or resource. It was a living, sacred organism, a source of power and life. According to their beliefs, ancestral lands, the places where ancestors were buried, held special power. It was believed that the spirits of the ancestors, merging with the land, continued to protect their clan, granting them luck, fertility, and military prowess. The burial place of a great leader or shaman became a powerful source of spiritual energy, a kind of accumulator fueling the entire nation. But this power was a double-edged sword. If the burial site were to be desecrated by enemies, it could bring terrible calamities upon the entire nation, stripping it of the spirit's protection. Genghis Khan, who saw himself not just as a lucky general, but as a man marked by the special grace, Sulde, of the eternal sky, must have thought about how to preserve this sacred energy after his death. He likely believed that his body, buried in a secret, sacred place, would become an eternal source of power for the empire he created and for his golden lineage. This place was to become the unseen heart of the Mongol world, its spiritual generator. Therefore, the choice of location was critical. According to one of the most common legends, he willed to be buried near the mountain Burkhan Khaldun in northern Mongolia. This area was sacred to his Borjigin clan. It was here, in the dense forests, that he hid from his enemies in his youth, and it was to this place that he attributed his miraculous salvation, considering it his personal protector. By burying him there in secret, his companions were not just hiding his body, they were connecting his spirit to this source of ancestral power, so that it could eternally nurture his descendants. And the bloody secret surrounding the funeral was necessary to protect this spiritual power plant. Any outsider who learned its location could, willingly or unwillingly, violate its sanctity, short-circuiting this flow of energy. That is why they were destroyed. In this mystical logic, the killing of witnesses was not mere cruelty, but a necessary ritual, a protective ward, designed to safeguard not just a grave, but the future of the entire Mongol people. The moment comes when all fears, calculations, beliefs, and premonitions crystallize into a single, cold, and irrevocable decision. Lying on his deathbed in his camp, in the midst of the conquered, but not subdued, Tangut land, Genghis Khan gives his final command. He summons the most loyal of the loyal, a few generals and commanders of his personal guard, the Keshiktan. These are men who have been through fire and water with him, whose loyalty was absolute and beyond question. To them, he dictates his will. His body must be taken to his native Mongol steppes and secretly buried in a place he has designated. But the main condition is that no one, absolutely no one, outside this small circle of initiates, must know where his grave is. And to ensure this secrecy, he orders them to do something monstrous, to kill everyone who meets the funeral cortege. The order was absolute and allowed no exceptions. It didn't matter who it was, a man, a woman, an old person, or a child. It didn't matter if it was an accidental encounter or intentional curiosity. Anyone whose gaze fell upon this procession had to die. But that was not all. After the body was committed to the earth, all the slaves and servants who performed the burial work were to be killed. And then, the soldiers who killed those slaves were to be killed. A bloody chain reaction had to occur, one that would sever all threads leading to the secret. This was the logic of absolute control, taken to its inhuman extreme. He, who had spent his life building an order based on law, in his final act, stepped beyond all law, except that of his own will. He turned his most loyal companions into the executors of a monstrous crime, binding them forever with an oath of silence, sealed by rivers of blood. To the modern mind, this logic seems like the madness of a maniac. But for Genghis Khan and his circle, it was the supreme act of state wisdom. He was eliminating the human factor, the most unreliable variable in any equation. He did not rely on loyalty, fear, or conscience. He relied on death as the only reliable guardian of the secret. By giving this order, he was, in effect, designing his own eternity, constructing his own myth. He knew that a secret surrounded by such horror would live for centuries, intriguing and frightening descendants, and that this would be the best monument to his unbending will. In August of 1227, at the height of summer, when the steppe is full of life and the air hums with insects, the heart of the shaker of the universe stopped. He died in his war camp during the siege of the Tangut capital, which his army had already doomed to total destruction. The circumstances of his death, like his entire life, are shrouded in legend. The official version states that he died from the consequences of his fall from the horse and illness. But other, more dramatic versions exist. One, popular among conquered peoples, claims he was killed by a captive Tangut princess whom he had taken as a concubine. On their first night, she supposedly inflicted a mortal wound with a hidden dagger, or castrated him, avenging her people before taking her own life. This version is most likely fiction, an attempt to humiliate the great conqueror by attributing such a shameful death to him. But there is another legend that gives his passing a mystical, cosmic scale. It is said that on the night of his death, a great thunderstorm broke out. The sky over the steppe was split by flashes of lightning. Deafening thunder roared, and rain poured down. According to Tengris beliefs, such a storm was a sign that the eternal blue sky, Tengri, was taking the spirit of his chosen one. This was not death, it was an ascension. His earthly path was over, and he was returning to the celestial host, to watch over his empire from above. This legend fit perfectly with the image he had created. It turned his death from a biological fact into a sacral event. He did not depart defeated by illness or an enemy, but summoned by a higher power. And this mystical aura was extremely important for his heirs. The Khan's death was hidden from the army for a time, to complete the rout of the Tanguts and avoid panic. His body was placed in a cart, as if he were still alive, and only a narrow circle of initiates knew the terrible truth. For several days, the world's greatest empire was without its ruler, but it continued to move and fight by inertia, obeying the will of a man already dead. It was a terrifying symbol of his power, which, it seemed, could overcome even death itself. When the last Tangut city had fallen, and the will of the dead Khan was fulfilled, the funeral cortege began its long and terrible journey, northeast, toward the native Mongol steppes. It was the strangest procession in history. It moved in complete silence, without any signs of mourning. It was accompanied by an elite detachment of several thousand warriors from his personal guard. Their task was to create a zone of alienation around their master's body, a space of absolute silence and death. The methodical and merciless execution of the final order began. Squads of horsemen fanned out for many miles on either side of the main route, combing the area. Any living thing they encountered was destroyed. This was not just people, random travelers, shepherds, inhabitants of remote settlements. According to some chroniclers, they even killed animals and birds, so that no living creature could witness the journey. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din wrote, "They killed everyone they met on the road, so that news of his death would not reach any land." This was a journey of hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles, and its entire length was marked by the blood of innocent victims. It is hard to imagine the psychological state of the warriors carrying out this order. They were not monsters. They were men who devoutly believed they were fulfilling a sacred duty to their deceased lord. For them, this was the final act of loyalty, the highest expression of discipline. Every person they killed was another stone laid in the wall that would forever shield the great Khan's secret from the rest of the world. The atmosphere within the caravan itself must have been unbearable. On the one hand, the deepest grief for their departed leader, whom they revered as a god. On the other, the chilling horror of the mission entrusted to them. They were transporting the body of their father and protector, and simultaneously bringing death to all life around them. This dissonance, this combination of the sacred and the monstrous, was the very essence of Genghis Khan's final plan. He wanted the secret of his grave to be born, not just in silence, but in an absolute dead stillness, paid for by thousands of lives. The details of the burial itself are hidden just as securely as its location. We can only guess at what happened, based on fragmented accounts from chronicles and oral legends. When the funeral cortege finally reached the sacred area, near the mountain, Burkhan Khaldun, the final act of this bloody drama began. A deep grave was dug. There, along with the body of the great Khan, according to the custom of the nomadic nobility, untold treasures were placed. Gold and silver seized from dozens of countries, weapons, precious garments. According to some of the most gruesome versions, 40 of the most beautiful girls from noble families, as well as his best horses, were buried with him to serve him in the afterlife. After the grave was filled in, the process of covering the tracks began, taken to an absurd level of perfection. According to one of the most famous legends, a 1,000-horse herd was driven over the site to completely level the earth and destroy any sign of digging. Then, to be absolutely certain, the warriors diverted a nearby river, directing its waters straight over the burial site. The grave of the Shaker of the universe was forever hidden beneath water and river silt. According to another version, an entire forest was planted on the spot, 1,000 young trees, which in a few years would grow so dense that finding the original location would be impossible. But the bloody ritual did not end there. All the slaves and prisoners who had carried out this titanic work, digging the grave, diverting the river, planting the trees, were immediately executed. Then, a special squad of warriors executed those who had executed the slaves. This chain of death was broken only at the level of the highest dignitaries, who were the original guardians of the secret. They swore an oath of silence, which, it seems, they never broke. For many years afterward, a special detachment of warriors from the Uriankai tribe stood guard over this entire vast, forbidden zone, the Ikkorig. Anyone who accidentally or intentionally entered this territory was put to death. The secret was sealed and protected more securely than any other secret in human history. Having executed their lord's final command with terrifying precision, the Mongol Empire created the most paradoxical monument in history. The main monument to Genghis Khan is his complete and absolute absence. There is no mausoleum, no sarcophagus, not even a simple headstone. There is only emptiness, a mystery that has captivated the imaginations of researchers and adventurers for nearly 8 centuries. And this undiscovered grave, this legacy of absence, has proven to be a far more powerful and enduring monument than any pyramid or crypt. The tombs of Tutankhamun and the Chinese emperors have been found and studied, their secrets revealed, their treasures displayed in museums. They have been transformed from sacred objects into historical artifacts. The grave of Genghis Khan, however, remains a living myth to this day. It does not belong to history. It belongs to eternity. This absence of a material object allowed his image to transform. He ceased to be just a historical figure, a man of flesh and blood who died and was buried. In the consciousness of the Mongol people, he became an eternal guardian spirit. His Sulda, life force, was not locked in a tomb, but dissolved in his native land, in the sky, in the wind, forever protecting his people. For the rest of the world, he became an archetype, a symbol of absolute power, brilliant strategy, and unbending will. His undiscovered grave is the eternal question his genius poses to us. It is his final strategic maneuver, his final victory, not over armies, but over time itself. He forced the entire world to play by his rules, even after his death. As long as people search for his grave, they think of him, speak of him, argue about him. He remains relevant, alive, intriguing. Any tomb, once found, would put an end to this story. But the emptiness leaves an ellipsis. This was the supreme act of control over his own legacy. He did not allow posterity to turn him into an idol or a tourist attraction. He chose to remain a pure idea, an eternal myth of power, order, and mystery. And in that sense, his empty tomb is the most majestic of all possible monuments, a monument not built of stone, but of fear, loyalty, and brilliant foresight. And so, we return to the main question. Why did the Lord of the Universe, a man whose life was one continuous act of self-assertion on the world stage, order the death of everyone who witnessed his funeral? The answer, like the personality of Genghis Khan himself, is complex, multifaceted, and cannot be reduced to a single cause. The key to this paradox lies in the synergy, the intersection, of four powerful factors that shaped his worldview throughout his life. The first factor was his deep spiritual belief. As a true son of the steppe and a follower of Tengrism, he believed the body was a temporary vessel, and the spirit must return to the eternal sky and dissolve into the native earth to become its guardian. A magnificent tomb would have been a prison for his spirit and an act of pride, contradicting the will of Tengri. The second, equally important factor, was cold, strategic pragmatism. Genghis Khan was a genius of the preemptive strike. He understood perfectly that a known grave was a colossal vulnerability. It could become an object of desecration by enemies, a center for political intrigue and separatism, or the birthplace of a dangerous religious cult that could distort his main legacy, the Yasa. By destroying all information about the burial site, he neutralized all these future threats. The third factor was his personal psychology, forged in the fires of betrayal and humiliation. His life is a story of total mistrust of the world. He was betrayed by his own clan, by his sworn brother, by his vassals. This experience taught him that no one could be trusted. He believed the only guarantee of keeping a secret was not oaths, but the death of those who knew it. This was the logic of a man accustomed to solving problems radically and permanently. And finally, the fourth factor was political foresight and concern for the future of the empire. He saw the feud between his sons and feared that his grave would become an apple of discord in their struggle for power. By depriving them of this sacred object, he eliminated a potential catalyst for civil war. Thus, the bloody command was not the whim of a despot, but the quintessence of his entire life's philosophy. It was simultaneously a religious act, a military operation, a psychological defense, and a political testament. The killing of witnesses was a cruel, but from his perspective, an absolutely logical and necessary tactical move to achieve a great strategic goal, to ensure eternal and safe rest for himself and stability for his empire. Ultimately, the story of Genghis Khan and the secret of his grave transcends the biography of one man and becomes a profound, philosophical meditation on the nature of power, memory, and immortality. What is true immortality? Does it mean preserving one's name through the ages, as Alexander the Great dreamed? Or building eternal monuments, as the pharaohs did? Genghis Khan offered the world a third, paradoxical path. He understood that material monuments, no matter how grandiose, are ultimately doomed to destruction. Gold will be plundered, stones will turn to dust, and the names carved on them will be forgotten or distorted. He realized that the most indestructible form of memory is not a statement, but a question. Not a monument, but a mystery. By creating an impenetrable veil around his departure, he did not just hide his body, he ensured his eternal relevance. As long as humanity exists, it will ask the question, where is Genghis Khan buried? And every time they ask this question, people will remember him, his empire, his will, which proved capable of controlling the world even from beyond death. He won the victory over the greatest enemy of any ruler, oblivion. And he did it in the most unconventional way, through self-elimination from the physical world. His lesson is that true power is not control over territories or people, but control over the narrative, over one's own story. He wrote the finale of his own life, and that finale is open-ended. He left us not with an answer, but with an eternal riddle. And this riddle, this emptiness at the center of world history, hums and resonates far more powerfully than any, even the loudest, mausoleum. Genghis Khan proved that sometimes the most effective way to remain in history forever is to disappear from it at the right time and in the right way, leaving behind not a trace, but an echo. And that echo we hear to this day.